Hello book lovers, and welcome back or welcome to Natcat's Bookish Cafe. Today I am here to wrap up my October reading month. Alright, the month that many readers call the best reading month of the year has come and gone. And unfortunately for me, it was not a great reading month. It was a very interesting reading month. In fact, it was very different from all the other months if I'm looking at the range of ratings that I had. About halfway through the month, I decided to abandon some plans that I had made for a second vlog and really leaned into the mood reading in hopes that that would kind of help me out a little bit. Did it? A little bit, yeah. I'm definitely glad that I ended up mood reading because there were a couple books that I read that I really enjoyed. But once we look at my stats, you'll see why this was such a strange month for me. That being said, if you are new to my channel, the way that I do my wrap-ups is I review them from lowest rated to highest rated. But before we get into the reviews, I have some very basic stats to go over. So here in the month of October, I only ended up reading 5 books, which is one of the lowest numbers of the year. There was another month where I read 5 books, so it's tied for last place. It's definitely disappointing that I read so few books, but I will say that I ended up touching 5 other books, meaning I either read a couple chapters from books that I had started in previous months, or I even started some new books that I just didn't finish. So this is just the number of books that I actually finished. There was more reading happening, just not book finishing. Page count was also on the lower side, sitting at 1,236 pages, and audiobook hours was minuscule. I only completed 1 audiobook, a short novella, sitting at 3 hours. Looking at my average rating, unfortunately, it was on the lower side as well, sitting at a 3.7 stars. I usually like to be at a 4-star or higher. Obviously, that did not happen this month, and that is because of the huge range of ratings that I gave this month. I didn't double up on any ratings, and I didn't give any 4 stars. I am usually a 4-star girly. If I had to predict what I would give a book, the best chance of me winning that bet is betting on 4 stars. But this time I had 1 DNF, I had 1 2.5 star, I had 1 3-star, I had 1 3.5 star, no 4 stars, 1 4.5, and 1 5-star reading. Just all across the board. It was a weird month. There have been a lot of months where I haven't had anything lower than a 3.5, or at worst a 3-star. So getting a 3.5, a 3, and a 2.5 in one month was definitely pretty rough. But that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start with the DNF, and then we'll get into the books I actually finished from lowest rated to highest rated. The only DNF of the month is going to be The Rotting Room by Vicky Parr-Hampton, and this is a book that I read in my religious horror vlog. I will go ahead and link that up above so that you can get my more in-depth feelings and views about the 3 books that I read there. This one I actually predicted to be my highest rated book, and then I didn't even finish it. So I was way off base with my prediction for this book. This is a horror story following a nun who is going to a new abbey after her old abbey got disbanded because they were performing some sort of rituals that wasn't in line with the Catholic Church's beliefs. And she is now at this new abbey and is trying to just get settled and get familiar with their practices. And one of their practices is that they have this room of decomposition, where anytime one of the sisters ends up dying, they go into this room to essentially decompose, and you can pray over the body, but they also collect a lot of the liquids that end up dripping from the corpse, which is ew. And our character's like, that's weird. Never seen that before. Very suspicious. And one day a visitor ends up showing up claiming to be a sister from England, and she is hoping to find shelter there. Unfortunately, the sister is very sick and she ends up dying, and they place her into this room of decomposition. However, when she doesn't end up decomposing like she's supposed to, they start to suspect that she might be a saint, and it causes a little bit of madness in the abbey. However, our nun, along with a priest from the neighboring village, suspect that it's something a little bit darker, and they start to look into it. I ended up DNFing this book at around 130 pages. At the point that I DNF'd, this visitor had just passed away and had been placed into the decomposition room, and our nun was starting to notice that she doesn't really look the way a dead body should look. So 130 pages in, and we were just finally getting to the aspect of the story that the synopsis was talking about. This story to me was just too repetitive and slow moving and uneventful, and I enjoy a slow paced horror. You know, we like that build up and everything, but this story wasn't scary. It was a little bit on the cheesy side. It felt a little bit cheap. I know when I was reading some reviews of it to see if maybe I should try and finish it, a lot of people compared it to like a cheap Nun movie, and I was like, well, that's not something I'm interested in. And that's definitely the vibes that I was getting from this story. It was just a little bit too over the top, that it was hard to take any of the more sinister aspects of the story seriously. It was also very repetitive because we have a character who I'm pretty sure spent the majority of her life just being gaslit by the people around her, and so she had absolutely no faith in her own observational skills, and so she was constantly like, this is weird, but I'm just gonna trust the people around me. And I feel like based off of her experience at her last abbey, where she was like, this feels weird, we shouldn't be doing this, and then it proved to be true, that she would have a little bit more faith in her ability to tell right from wrong. But no, she was constantly just like relying on the people around her, and that obviously was not working out again. And we just over and over again had this woman being like, I should really learn my lesson from the last time where I didn't say anything, yet I'm not gonna say anything because I can't trust my overactive imagination. And it was just like that over any time something weird happened. She would be like, should I say something? No, it's probably just my imagination. And you're like, oh my gosh, girl, no, it's not. And then we also get the priest's point of view. His name is Bruno, and he is very attractive to, I believe her name was Raffaella, our nun, from the very first moment he saw her. And every time he started his chapter, it would like start off with him talking about like how attractive she was and how he shouldn't be feeling these things. And also we kept getting flashbacks to his childhood, and it was just stretching out this childhood story of his, which, I mean, at the point that I ended, the story had absolutely no relevance to the story. I'm sure eventually the author would have tied it in, but I was just like, every time we go back to Bruno, I'm gonna have to hear about this hot nun as well as his traumatic childhood. And so the author was just dragging all of this out, and it just was so boring. It was just so boring. So I did end up DNFing it, and because I DNF'd it, I did not rate it. Moving on to the books that I actually finished, starting with the lowest rated at 2.5 stars, is the one audiobook that I listened to this month, and that is going to be The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. This is an author I have been interested in for a while. I have his story, The Changeling, on my TBR, but I've heard quite a few good things about this story, and it was short, so I figured it would be an easy read. Did it take me the entire 21 days of my hold to finish this 3-hour book? Yes, because I had absolutely no interest in picking it up. However, it was just so short that I was like, you know what, Natalie, just push through and maybe it'll get interesting in the end. And yes, there were some interesting things that happened in this book. I have been thinking about this book a lot for the last few days since I finished it, and there are a lot of complicated feelings with it because it is one of those books where I really enjoy the themes, the messaging. I appreciate what the author is doing. I just don't like the way that it is presented. For me, unfortunately, I didn't really have any interest or connection to any of the characters. The plot to me was just a little bit nonsensical, and the writing was okay. It wasn't bad writing, but it also wasn't anything that could make up for the other lacking aspects of the story. Essentially, in this book, we are following Tom, and he is, I don't really know if you would call him a scam artist, but he kind of seems to be someone who attracts people who need kind of sketchy jobs done. And one day he is playing his guitar and this white man approaches him. I think this is set in 1920s, which is not a time period I really like. I'm not a big fan of the 20th century, so the time period of this book is already working against it. Anyway, racism is rampant at this time in history. It's set in America, and he's playing his guitar and this white man approaches him and is like, I would really like it if you came and played at my party and I will pay you like $500, $600, which back then was like a crap ton of money. So he's like, yeah, no, I'll definitely do that. That sounds great. And so starts his interaction with this white man who has some sort of connection, or at least he's been researching this king in the sea kind of situation. It was a Lovecraftian story. Apparently it was based off of an actual story of Lovecraft. I don't think I've ever read or seen any movies that are Lovecraftian in nature. I'm not really sure, I might have, but to me, this kind of writing or type of storytelling or genre was too similar to magical realism, which I'm not a huge fan of. In fact, I'll talk about that a little bit with one of the other books that I read this month. And so to me, it felt very much like the story was underdeveloped. Like we just wanted the vibes of this magical being without doing any sort of actual work to describe why there's this magical being, what this magical aspect of the world has been to humans in the past, what it could be. It all just felt, and I hate to say it, lazy. So I kind of left the story being like, well, that was really underwhelming and left me very unsatisfied. It was one of those stories where I really could take some important things away from the story. I mean, it definitely focused on racism to the point where I was becoming almost annoyed, and I think that was almost the point, because part of me was thinking about this book right here, excuse me, little ghost, When No One Was Watching by Alyssa Cole. This book is a horror book that focuses a lot on racism, and you see a lot of micro and macro aggressions within this book. However, in this book, it was just so blatant and in your face that it almost became exhausting and to read about, and you almost start to like roll your eyes and be like, are you really saying this? Like, is this really how you think? And at first I was like annoyed by it, but then I was like, okay, put yourselves in the shoes of someone who experiences this kind of racism day after day after day. Like, yeah, it's going to get annoying. It's going to get frustrating. It's going to become infuriating. They're going to feel the things that you're feeling right now. And unfortunately, that's just the reality of the situation. And I started to think about like today in Trump's America, where behavior like this is becoming more and more prevalent. And I was like, wow, the way that I feel about the racist characters in here is how I feel about a lot of far-right MAGA America and what they have to say. So I do think that I kind of appreciate the in-your-face racism because it's unfortunately very realistic, but the rest of the story, it just felt too underdeveloped for me. I just really felt like the plot was all over the place. Like, it really, to me, didn't make sense. And I'm not saying that I'm someone who needs like a very strong magic system that's heavily developed and everything. You know, I do like it to be rooted a little bit in logic though. And to me, this wasn't. It was just as if Victor Lavelle wanted a fantasy element, but was like, well, I don't want to put in any of the work or the world building or any of the explanations in it. So I'm just gonna throw this guy in for the vibes. And then the ending, to me, it felt like we were doing a whole lot of something for little to no impact. I think the ending had like a little bit of commentary on climate change, which was kind of out of left field, but I was like, okay. It was very much like humans' greed, humans' flaws and everything will eventually catch up to him and destroy him. Climate change, global warming, eventually this will probably wipe out the human race. Yes, I get that, but what did that really have to do with this story? Especially because to me, climate change wasn't really any part of the story outside of the fact that this king lived in the sea. Are we talking about rising sea levels? So I didn't know if maybe I was just like overthinking it, underthinking it, what was going on. But in the end, I just felt myself being rather disappointed by the story. He's definitely an author I will give a second chance. I don't like to judge authors off their short stories or novellas because I'm not a short story novella girly. So I'll definitely read his stuff in the future. It seems like he is someone who has important things to say and I'm more than happy to listen. But unfortunately, this book ended up being just a 2.5 for me. All right, moving on to our 3-star read. And this is another book that made an appearance in my religious horror vlog. And it's also the one that has a little bit of magical realism that I said I would talk about later in this video, and that is going to be The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling. On the one hand, considering that the last book I read by this author was a DNF, a 3-star is not too terrible. It means it was a decent book. I had a fine time with it, but there were quite a few things that I didn't enjoy about it. So this is a religious horror story that is set in medieval times. We are following a castle or keep that is under siege, and at the start of the story it has been under siege for a very long time and they are starting to run out of food. And we are following the perspective of 3 different women. We are following Fosne, I believe was her name, and she is considered a heretic. She was part of this organization known as the Priory. I have a little cheat sheet in here for all these words. And the Priory is a religious organization, but they're heavily based in science, while Fosni, on the other hand, her methods are more based in, I guess, what you consider almost magic, and she is attempting to create food out of nothing. On the other hand, we are following Sir Voin, and she is a knight, and she is essentially the right hand of the king, though she considers herself a bit more of a lapdog, and she has had a very successful career as a knight. However, recently she's been feeling a little bit more like she's being paraded around, and she is in this situation where she can't really do anything, and as someone who has been very proactive throughout her life with her career as a knight, this is a very frustrating situation for her. And then finally we have Lillian Lee Trila. Wow, I was way off. Trila. And she is a fallen noblewoman. Essentially, her father was killed for treason, and she is seeking revenge, specifically against Sir Voin, who helped with his decapitation. And she has been in this castle for a while and kind of has put her revenge plot on hold because people and herself are starving. At one point, when all hope is lost, these three beings arrive, and they take the forms of three of the saints that the Priory worship, and they bring food and prosperity to this keep. But they also bring a very controlled sense of madness, and our characters are very skeptical about who these beings are. I really like the first half of this book. I had a really good time with the first half, really building these characters. They have very interesting dynamics with each other. Throughout the story, we kind of watch their relationships shift as they rely on each other throughout the story, as they get to know each other more throughout the story, as they learn to forgive each other and go through all these traumatic events together. I think the relationship between these three women was probably the most interesting aspect of the story. And in the beginning, we really get to kind of learn about these three women. They're very different. I think they're rather interesting characters. And we also get to learn about the keep and a little bit about this magic system with the Priory, as well as Fosni that's going on. Then the saints show up. And at first, it's not too terrible. The story has been kind of weird since the beginning, but the more the saints are there, the more fever dreamy this whole book gets, and that's when it goes a little bit maybe into the magical realism. I'm never quite sure exactly what magical realism is. To me, magical realism is we are living in what could be considered a normal world, but there's just like a smidge of magic that is considered just part of everyday life. And that's kind of what's happening here. And in the second part of the book, it was just leaning too much into that genre that I don't enjoy that much. I also realized in the second half of the book that despite the fact that I found these characters really interesting, I didn't really care about them on an emotional level. There were situations where their life was very much in danger, and it caused me to realize that if one of the characters did not survive the book, I would not be that upset about it. So as a character-driven reader, that was a little bit of a bummer. But the main issue was definitely the fact that this book left a lot unanswered, and I do like some answers. I'm not someone who loves an open ending. You know, if you want to know what these saints are, exactly why they came, how they came to be, how they're doing what they're doing, you're not really gonna learn that in this book. In fact, this book is just gonna leave you with more questions than answers, and I found that to be very frustrating. I think one of the reasons it's so frustrating for me is because I really felt like this story was trying to tell me something. Like this story had some sort of deep messaging. The author mentions in her note that she wrote this story during the pandemic, that she wrote this while she was experiencing her first miscarriage and eventually went on to experience multiple miscarriages. So you just have to know that there is a lot that the author seems to be trying to put into this book. And while she fully admits that, that kind of makes this book messy, I think it makes it messy to a detrimental degree where I'm like, what do you want me to take away from this story? What do you want me to focus on while I'm reading this book? Because it just felt a little bit all over the place. Like we kind of lost the thread in the second half of the book. So I ended up giving it 3 stars because it had such a strong beginning for me. But unfortunately, the ending just left me a little bit disappointed. But I will say I've heard a few people saying that the beginning is very slow and not that enjoyable, while the ending is more exciting and enjoyable. So, I clearly have a little bit of a different opinion than other people who have read this book. I definitely would still recommend this book, but you have to be the kind of reader who's okay with walking away without all the answers. Up next, we have a book that was technically on my October TBR, but I didn't expect to actually get to it because I was planning on those 2 vlogs. But when I canceled that second vlog, I ended up picking up The Resurrectionist by A. Ray Dunlap, and I have just been really wanting to read this book for quite a while, and this ended up being a 3.5 stars. So not terrible, but definitely disappointing because I was thinking it definitely had the elements in it that could make it a 5-star read, and it just wasn't. So this is a historical story. It is set in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and we are following a man who wants to be a surgeon, and he actually came from a rather wealthy family, and he was supposed to join the clergy, I believe, because of his position as 3rd son, but he decides to go to Edinburgh because that is kind of the center of scientific academia right now, and his family has come on hard financial times. After his father died, it became clear that he had a bit of a gambling addiction, and so he is living on a very small allowance, and he ends up attending the school, meeting some other boys, and the other boys are like, listen, the school's fine, you definitely have to go to the school. However, it's the private surgical practices that you have to go to if you actually want to learn anything, because they are the ones who have the cadavers that you can practice on. And unfortunately, these schools cost additional money. And so in order to help pay for the schooling, he ends up working with Nye as a body snatcher. So essentially right now we are still in a time of history where, donating your body to science is just not a thing. So in order for there to be scientific advancements, the scientists have to get their hands a little bit dirty and snatch some bodies from the grave. And while he has joined this team of body snatchers and is getting closer to Nye, they start to realize that there is someone going in and kind of bullying the other groups of snatchers into going under their rule. Like almost the mob is kind of getting involved in it, and they're kind of trying to figure out how to avoid their prime real estate from being taken over, and of course they don't want to get into trouble with these very dangerous men. I would say the strongest part of the story is the romance element. It's not a huge part of the story. I would hardly consider this a romance, but our character, what's your name? Jamie? James' relationship with Nye is so lovely. I adored the 2 of them together. This is definitely about queer love in a time where that just isn't allowed to prosper. And we definitely in a few scenarios really see the fear that specifically Nye feels for being caught, because unfortunately during this time, if you were caught having this kind of relationship, it could be the hangman's noose for you. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. They really started out as like work partners and then became really close friends and companions, and then they kind of developed a more romantic relationship. So it had a nice natural development to it, and the two of them were both very passionate about science and advancing science, and especially when it comes to the medical field. And for the most part, they were relatively good when it comes to communication, because they came from two very different lifestyles. Nye grew up relatively poor, while James, even though he is now technically poor as well, grew up rather rich, and he really did a good job of listening to Nye's perspectives and learning from that, and kind of like shedding a lot of his previous beliefs and biases. So I really enjoyed their relationship. They were so cute together, so sweet. That was definitely the strongest part of the relationship. The rest of the story, though, felt a little flat. I'm gonna be honest. I was very underwhelmed by the story, by the mystery aspect of it, I guess. I kind of felt a little bit like an afterthought. The author mentioned that some of the villains in here were inspired by real life criminals, and I feel like considering they were based off of real life criminals, they could have been a little bit more interesting or maybe even just a bigger part of the story. And so it just felt a little bit weak for me. I think that the author really wanted to talk about the process of body snatching, because especially in the beginning of the book, that was a big part. I think that's where she put the majority of her effort. And it was interesting, but does it need to be the focus of an entire book? I don't know, especially because I feel like there was some really interesting stuff happening at these medical schools where they were really advancing like medical treatment, and Nye was also kind of looking into how to use his medical knowledge for police forensics kind of situation. So there's all this other interesting stuff going on that I think the author could have focused on a lot more. Kind of at the end of the book, there was kind of this hint that maybe the police are like, well, maybe there is something to this medical forensic stuff. So I would not be opposed if the author wrote a little bit more within this timeline, because I feel like that is a very interesting development in the police world, and reading it from the perspective of these two characters that I also really like, I think would be a lot of fun. But overall, I think it just ended up being a little bit underwhelming plot-wise, but I did really enjoy the characters, so I did end up giving it a 3.5 stars, and would definitely consider reading more from this author, because this might be a debut novel. I actually have no idea. I just said that. It might not be. I might just straight up be lying. But I had a good time with it, and I do recommend it, but I would pick this up more for the historical vibes and maybe a little bit of the characters, more so than if you're really looking for like a good mystery. All right, moving into my top 2 books of the month, starting with the 4.5 star read, we have a book that I picked up completely spontaneously. A friend of mine mentioned that this book was currently free, and so I went ahead and snatched up the ebook, and I wasn't planning on reading it, but then I was kind of sitting there not really feeling any of the books that I was reading. I was like, I want something kind of short, fun, maybe a little smutty, queer, and then I was like, you know what book I just downloaded? Blood and Flowers by Mars Adler. So this is an author that you've seen me talk about a couple times this year. I just discovered them, and so far they have kind of been my go-to when I'm feeling a little bit slumpy. Their work has really been working for me. It's always queer. So far the 3 that I've read have had trans characters in them, and it is usually erotic horror, and that is what this book is as well. And in this book we are following 2 characters who are from rival vampire clans. One of our characters, Valerian, is an actual full-blooded vampire. However, the character whose POV we actually read from is Elio, and he is actually only half vampire, so he's not like actually a vampire. He doesn't like drink blood or have fangs or have any of the abilities. However, because of his mother's side of the family, he is a witch. And the 2 of them over the past few months have been performing these rituals around a old manor of Valerian's family because it has a curse on it. So the 2 clans have this temporary peace so that they can get rid of this curse on this manor. And Elio kind of volunteered to do this because of his magical skills. He thinks that he can help with the curse, and Valerian is actually the one who put a lot of the traps of this curse in place, but things have just gotten a little bit out of hand. And so the 2 of them have been working together reluctantly, and at the beginning of this book they have officially taken down all of the traps. They've been meeting twice a month for the last 12 months to get rid of the traps, and they are finally ready to actually enter this house. So this is a haunted house story, and it was so much fun. I haven't picked up too many haunted house books, but out of the ones that I have read, this one definitely worked the best for me. If you're someone who likes a classic haunted house, you have someone entering a home they're familiar with and they're like, that's not where it's supposed to be, and this looks a little bit different, and you have doors that lead to places that they're not supposed to lead. You have hallways that stretch on, and you have to keep walking and walking and walking and walking until you eventually meet your destination. There are places that the house won't let you enter. There seems to be something watching you. It was just so much fun. You have the classic like portraits, like their eyes are watching you. It was very like the haunted house from Disneyland. I had a ton of fun with it, and despite the fact that I'm saying it was fun, there were definitely some very sinister and uncomfortable moments within the story because it is still a horror, and this is definitely one of those horror houses that was built out of trauma, and I really like haunted houses that are built out of trauma and just kind of getting to explore what that trauma is and how our characters can overcome it to kind of like help whatever is in that house find peace. And that's really what you get in this book. Excellent writing, excellent atmosphere. It was very spooky, but also very sexy because I said that this is a erotic horror. So there are definitely a lot of elements in this story that cause our characters to be kind of like, will they, won't they? It seems like they're very attracted to each other. And while they're in this house, they're like, is it something that the house is doing, or are we just actually attracted to each other? There are a couple smut scenes in here that were very well done. The thing I like about Mars's writing is that despite the fact that this is a erotica, it is not like smut scene after smut scene after smut scene. There is always like a lot of build up between the scenes where you are definitely getting a lot of sexual tension, but they very much like resist acting on it, and that just makes it all the sweeter. And I myself, while I like a good smut scene, don't like too much otherwise it gets like repetitive and like a little bit boring. So I like the fact that they usually have maybe like 2 to 3 smut scenes per book. I think that's just the right amount. I think that this book perfectly balanced kind of this enemies to lovers, won't they, will they kind of romance with the spooky fun elements of the haunted house. I do believe that this is going to be a series because there are definitely some things that are left unresolved towards the end of this book. Both of our characters definitely have daddy issues. Their dads are assholes, and I'm definitely eager to see what they do about this kind of rivalry that is between their families that has been going on for so long that they don't actually know why they're rivals anymore. I would say, if I had to compare this, it has like the teeniest smidge of Romeo and Juliet going on. I also kind of felt like it had some Haunting of Bly Manor vibes going on when it comes to like the house and the Lady in the Lake kind of vibes. So I had a really good time with this. I'm continuing to really enjoy this author and definitely am interested to see what happens next in this story. All right, moving on to the final read in the 1 5-star. This is the third and final book that was mentioned in my religious horror vlog. And if you really want to know my thoughts on this book, I highly recommend that you go over there because I started crying while I was reviewing that book. I don't think I'll start crying this time. I think I had just finished the book. I was in a very emotional place. But if you really want to like hear my in-depth thoughts about this book, definitely go ahead and check out that vlog. And that is going to be for American Rapture by CJ Leeds. Wow. What a amazing book. Do not be surprised if you see this in my top books of the year. This book gave me exactly what I wanted when it comes to religious horror, when it comes to the kind of commentary that I want to see with that kind of story. This is a pandemic story. We are following a young woman who grew up in a very Catholic household, very strict, and 5 years before the start of this book, her brother had actually been sent away because his parents found out that he was queer. And so he was sent away to this facility where troubled kids go. And she has never forgiven her parents for that, because despite the fact that she is religious and she does believe a lot of the things that they preach, she doesn't think that there's anything wrong with her brother. She doesn't think that he deserved to be torn away from his family, and she misses him desperately, and she's really struggling in her household with all her parents' like attention on her, especially because she is 17 years old. She is starting to kind of notice boys and girls around her, and she is really struggling with these thoughts because she has been told her whole life that those are sinful thoughts and that she could burn for having those thoughts. On top of that, her body is changing, and so other people are noticing her differently. And on top of that, there is this flu that seems to be creeping closer and closer to where they live. Now, what this flu is a virus that when it infects people, they become incredibly lustful, and it is spread through bodily fluids, saliva, blood, semen, things like that. And at the beginning of this book, once this pandemic really hits where she's living, she is separated from her parents and she is kind of on her own for the first time, and she decides that the best thing to do is to try to find her brother. And so she sets out on this journey to try to get to him. And along the way, she starts to gather like this little group of people around her, and she is just really being thrown into the real world as first. I mean, she's like, whoa, I did not realize how sheltered I was. Everyone's surprised that she knew so little about this pandemic. She knows so little about sex, relationship, boys, her body, all of those things. And despite the fact that the world is kind of falling apart around her, she is absorbing all of this and really growing as a person and unlearning some of her religious trauma. The character growth that we see in her is really interesting and is exactly what I like to see when it comes to a person who has grown up in a very religious area, who has been very isolated by religion. She very much is still a believer, but she's starting to root out some of those more toxic aspects of the religion and kind of forming her own beliefs and becoming her own woman. And it's really great to see. On top of that, there is a lot of commentary in this story when it comes to the spread of religious extremism. There is this cult of people who are seeing this plague as like God serving punishment, and they don't want the plague to be ended. They don't want there to be a vaccine because they're like, no, you're interfering with God's plan. And it very much has this parallel of a spread of a virus with those extremist views. And that was really interesting to read about. On top of that, it talks a lot about the fear of like sexual assault, especially when it comes to women, because obviously we have this virus where people become very lustful and they essentially attack people and try to sexually assault them. And that is a fear that stays with our characters throughout this entire book. And it is unfortunately a fear that a lot of women carry with them day to day, even when there isn't some sort of pandemic. And we see this in the fact that even before the pandemic really strikes, our character gets inappropriately approached by men. And we also see that during the pandemic, there are people that aren't affected that are approaching her in these inappropriate ways and making her feel really unsafe and uncomfortable. And so we kind of have this discussion about the female body and how dangerous it can be to just exist in it. But we also have some moments to show how strong the female body is, and exactly how much power women can have in their bodies. And so there was just so many wonderful things in this book, but there's also a lot of terrible things. This book definitely made me cry. There was a lot of sad moments, a lot of moments of loss and grief. It was just really hard because this author did such a great job of getting me connected to a lot of these side characters, and unfortunately not all of them do survive this story, so it is definitely hard to read this. But I had an amazing time with it. I really love the messaging in here. I think it's really relevant to what we are experiencing today. I took so much from the story and really think that other people could as well. So I will say, despite the fact that this book seems to focus heavily on sexual violence, there really isn't any on-page sexual violence. It's very close. It's very prevalent on the sidelines, but it's not overly grotesque or anything. There are some gross moments in here. It is a horror. But to me, as someone who is at least a little sensitive to sexual violence, I was worried that if it would be too much, I would have to DNF. It never got even close to too much. But of course, do check trigger warnings. It is a horror book, so it is up to you to decide if you want to read it, but I do highly suggest it. All right, guys, those are the books that I ended up reading or DNFing this month. Considering how much I love to yap about the books that I read, maybe it's a good thing that I'm reading less, because these wrap-ups definitely are not shorter. But that being said, let me know what your favorite and least favorite book of the month were. Obviously, my favorite is going to be The American Rapture, and my least favorite is going to be The Ballad of Black Tom. As always, guys, thank you so much for supporting my channel by watching my videos, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!